Hello, everyone. This is Marvel Champions Deck Discussions, or MC Deck Discussions, and this is Abi Small, but you can call me Abis. Our primary focus here is to discuss Marvel Champions decks, and that's what we're going to do again today. Feel free to use the timestamps to skip ahead to any part of the video that you're particularly interested in. All right, so we have here an Ant-Man deck, which is Scott Lang as his alter ego, and this is called Laying Down the Law. It is a Justice deck with exactly 40 cards. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the preliminary notes here to start with. If you do happen to be looking at these notes, you'll see that you could skip ahead, also just go right down to the purple. I'll just show you that real quickly. Right, purple, all caps, bold. These are the notable elements of play. So a person could, if they were reading this, they could skip right down to there if they don't care about the preliminaries. So let's get into the preliminaries. So first of all, this was created from a deck request by Winning Hand Podcast. Requested that I build an Ant-Man Justice deck using only cards through Ant-Man's release. Please see Winning Hand's channel. By the way, I highly recommend the All Hands on Deck series. But you'll find all kinds of interesting discussions there. Boom Guy is a great host for his guests, and they definitely have a good time there and know a lot about Marvel Champions. Now, because this is only through Ant-Man's release, that means that I consider this to be a beginner's deck. And so you can treat it accordingly. However, I think even those who are experienced might see some interesting elements to this deck. The second preliminary item is the pack filter tip from Solo Marvel Champion. So after watching my previous video, Solo Marvel Champion gave a tip with regard to when you're creating decks. You can actually do. I was unchecking a whole bunch of boxes from that. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit. And so when I was creating this deck, I was going into the pack filters. And when I showed in my video before that you could just uncheck all the decks you don't want. So in this case, I wanted everything up through Ant-Man. So you can uncheck through here. But that's the long way to do it. So what was suggested is that instead I could, if one of these is unchecked, I could use the Shift key and check it, and it will check only that one. Then I can easily add just the packs that I wish to, which would be up through Ant-Man instead. So that's a lot faster. So thank you very much, Solo Marvel Champion, for that tip. I'll come back to there. You'll see that I have a link to his channel, so you can go ahead and check that out. So let's go back. And then the last thing I wanted to mention for the preliminary items is the potential deck modifications depending upon the villain. So actually, I think I'll wait till I discuss the deck till we come back to that, because then it'll make more sense. So we'll come back to that afterwards. I do want to mention real quickly the villains tested against. So once again, currently these are the villains I'm using. I'll probably switch it up pretty soon. So I have Claw, Rhino with the Doomsday Chair Encounter set instead of his usual one, the recommended one, which includes MODOK. And then the Mutant Genesis villains that include Sabretooth, Project Wide Awake, Master Mold, Mansion Attack, and Magneto. And the results for that there was one loss each for Expert against Rhino, Mansion Attack, and Magneto, all of which were then followed by victories against said villains. So that meant 14 victories out of the 17 games. So very good considering the level of villains that were being faced and that this is a beginner deck. So notice it does say 6 packs required here. So let's go ahead and start looking into the deck and some of the notes on the deck. So let's skip down here. And if we go down, here we go. The notable elements of play. So the gigantic, though sometimes tiny power of Ant-Man's cards and abilities. So Ant-Man has some very strong cards and hero abilities with flipping to various hero forms. So even with a more limited selection of packs, I think it is more important to keep the deck count down to that minimum 40 cards. And for some people, that's always, one of their highest priority or extremely high priority. But that allows his cards to be the ones that are most likely to show up. So I do consider that to be more important when you have more beginning decks. When including his hero abilities, Ant-Man himself can deal either 3 or 4 damage every turn, or remove 2 or 3 threat. And he does have 2 powerful attack cards with Giant Stomp. So if we take a look, let's go ahead and look at his abilities. So we can see first his hero ability. It just mentions the tiny ability, so I'll talk about the giant ability. So when he's in tiny form, so Ant-Man has a card, that allows him to change forms, or in his card, he can change to forms to giant form and to tiny form. So you can see in tiny form that he has, it says 2 thwart, 2 attack. So there's a mistake on that, actually. When he's in tiny form, he has 2 thwart and 1 attack and 2 defense. He does have a hand size of 5, and his hit points are 12. But he has this ability, Puny Pest. Response: after you change to this form, you remove 1 threat from a scheme. So that's very similar when he goes to giant form. So when he goes to giant form, instead he has 1 thwart and 3 attack and 3 defense. And his hand size reduces down to 4, but he has an ability there where the response is after you change to this form, so the giant form, then you remove or you deal 1 damage to an enemy. So those are his 2 forms. So that's a very powerful little response there. Plus, in tiny form, being able to thwart for 2, in giant form, being able to attack for 3. So between those, in giant form, that means he can do 3 or 4 damage just from himself without any cards being used. And when he's in tiny form, he can do either 2 or 3 threat removal. So those are very good. That's very good. Threat removal and damage output just from the hero cards themselves, or I should say the hero themselves. On top of that, as far as damage is concerned, Ant-Man has Giant Stomp, and Giant Stomp, which he can only play in Giant Hero form, allows him to deal 1 damage to each minion, and then deal 8 damage to any enemy in particular. So very often wanting to save that up. It is a cost of 3, so wanting to generally save that 8 damage for the villain, though here and there's some minions that one might want to get rid of using that. But he has only 1 event here, so the Hive Mind for Thwart, and he has to be in tiny hero form, and it only removes 2 threat from a scheme, though it can go to remove 1, 2, or 3 more additional threat from that scheme for each Army of Ants support that he has under his control. So if we look at Army of Ants, where is that? Where's his support? Here it is, Army of Ants. So he has 3 copies of that. So we click on that. So if he could have up to 3 of these and remove more with that. But that does mean that Hive Mind, going back to Hive Mind, is, as long as we're here, let's talk about these. These are actually a great way to deal damage, and it's not an attack, so you can deal damage even if guard and minion with guard is in play. So if you're in tiny hero form, exhaust Army of Ants, deal 1 damage to an enemy. So, since you can have 3 of these and they only cost 1 each, you can really get the damage to add up in tiny form. Okay, so the damage output is pretty good, but what my main point here with regard to threat removal is, yes, as a hero, he can remove threat pretty decently, but he only has Hive Mind, 1 copy of Hive Mind for a cost of 2 that has very inconsistent threat removal. So a Justice deck can help to make up for that. So let's move on to the next note, which has to do with that, right? So if we look at shoring up the tiny thwarting and while increasing card draw for Ant-Man. So he only has 1 copy of his thwart event, as we said. However, Lay Down the Law can greatly increase, can greatly shore up that weakness and then clear the area as well. So let's head back over to those cards over here. So we can see that Lay Down the Law, this is a very, very powerful card for Ant-Man in particular, because it only costs 1, and it has this hero response. It's a thwart. After you change form, remove 3 threat from a scheme. 4 threat instead if you paid for this card using a mental resource. So a cost of 1 removing 3 or 4 threat is large. The only thing is you have to change form in order to do that. But since Ant-Man has two forms, giant form and tiny form, every single turn he can in fact change to a different hero form. Whether he's staying in hero form or in alter ego form, he can change to that and use this card almost every round. If he starts off in hero form and changes to alter ego form, then he wouldn't be able to use this. So Ant-Man is one that you actually do want to often stay in hero form. And we'll see some discussion come back up on that later on in the deck. So Lay Down the Law greatly helps Ant-Man with his ability to handle threat removal, and Clear the Area also helps to do that. Again, another 1-cost card, so some cheap threat removal as well. It removes 2 threat, which isn't a lot, but it's still decent. However, if this removes the last threat of that scheme, you draw a card. So it helps to partially pay for itself. Essentially, it costs 2 cards to pay it, because it's both the card you use, the card you use as a resource to pay for it, and then this card itself. So that's 2 cards out of your hand, the effective cost. But it's replaced with another card. However, it's actually pretty cool. If you use this card in Ant-Man's tiny hero form, and you happen to pay for it with his resource card. So let's move down to resource cards here for a bit. So notice we have the usual energy, genius, and strength that are often basic cards that are resource cards that are often put into most any deck because they're double resources. He has his own Pim particles. So let's click on that. So he has a resource hero response. After you spend this card, heal 2 damage from your hero if you're in giant hero form, which is great, or draw 1 card if you are in tiny hero form, which is also great. I found myself often playing Clear the Area in tiny hero form. So in tiny hero form, you draw a card because you're using Pim particles as a resource, and Clear the Area, if you cleared the last threat from a scheme, you also draw a card. So I would say at least half of the games, I would use Clear the Area with Pim, well, maybe more like 30 to 40% of the games, along with Pim particles, and I would draw 2 cards. I'd play Clear the Area, use Pim particles as the resource, and draw 2 cards back. So you essentially remove 2 threat for no cost at all, because you end up with 2 cards to replace the cards you just used. All right, let's move back down to that note. Here we go. All right, so we have those cards in order to take care of the threat. So we end up with a decent amount of threat removal, but we do end up with a little bit more. So here's a card I actually had never used before. So one of the things about constantly getting new cards in this game is you always want to use the new shiny stuff, and there tend to be a lot of great cards. And some of the older cards you maybe never use. So I've been playing this game for quite a few years, ever since the game came out. And I had never ever used Stealth Strike. And so I finally was able to see the value of this card to do 2 things for us. So let's go back up to the deck and see what those 2 things are. So here we go. We have 2 copies of Stealth Strike in this deck. So if I click on that, we can see it has a cost of 3, and it's an attack. A hero action, deal 4 damage to an enemy. If that enemy is defeated by this attack, remove 2 threat from a scheme. And I found this to be particularly effective in an Ant-Man deck. And here's why. So pretty much every time, I can't think of a time that I used this card and did not get to remove 2 threat from a scheme. At least if a minion was out. And that's when I would typically choose to use this card, is when a minion is out, or if I was about to defeat 1 stage of a villain, so that I could remove that threat. So when I would use this card, we would have a minion out. And the reason why this was particularly effective, even though not all minions have 4 life on them. However, if you happen to be set up to move into Ant-Man's giant form, remember in his giant form, he deals 1 damage immediately when he flips over. So you can adapt your usage of that damage plus any attack damage that he does to get the ally down to exactly what you need in order to defeat that ally with Stealth Strike, because Stealth Strike does 4 damage. So if I had an ally that had 5 hit points, and I would flip over to hero form, I deal 1 damage right away just from changing into hero form, and then I could finish that off with Stealth Strike with 4 damage and then remove 2 threat from a scheme, which meant I could then preserve the rest of his damage or thwarting for something else, which also proved effective. Let's say if I had another minion out, or I wanted to start dealing some damage to the villain. And but if that wasn't enough, maybe I would have another ally out who could do a couple points of damage. Because sometimes some of the minions might have 6 health, or maybe 8 health or 9 health. So I was able to, because since in giant form Ant-Man can do 3 damage from his attack, the combination of those abilities, 4 damage was just enough to finish off a minion time after time. And so I really saw a lot of value to Stealth Strike, especially because right afterwards it would remove 2 threat from a scheme and keep things under control. So that was a highly effective card, which I never really saw the value of previously because it's relatively expensive. In my mind, I was like, 3 cost removing 4 damage, that's not very good. But when you combine it with that additional 2 threat removal, it becomes a flexible card that does multiple things for you. And that begins to hold a lot more value than one might initially think, just based on the numbers. All right, let's move on down here. All right, now preserving a giant amount of health. We have 7 allies here. Oh, I thought I fixed this spelling error. Maybe it hasn't updated yet. So we have 7 allies, and they generally prove sufficient to defend Ant-Man. So let's look at those 7 allies real quickly. We have Agent Coulson, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Mockingbird, Nick Fury, Quake, and then Wasp is his own ally. So they generally served to, first of all, of course, help with threat removal and dealing damage to the villain, but also, of course, they were used as defenders to protect Ant-Man. So they help to preserve that. But in addition to that, Ant-Man has some of his own cards that help out. I did correct these errors, so sorry about not using the most recent version of this. Oh, actually, I do have another version. That's why. I'm going to switch to that right now. Okay, I'm on the other version here. All right, preserving a giant amount of health. So there's 7 allies to help with that. On top of that, one of those allies, Mockingbird, when Mockingbird enters play, you stun an enemy. So the stun, of course, so now you have Mockingbird out there to block, but plus there's a stun if the villain is able to be stunned. And then you also have the wrist gauntlets and Ant-Man's helmet to help preserve health as well. So let's look at those 2 cards in his own deck. So if we look at Ant-Man's helmet, so it's a cost of 3, it's an expensive card, but once you get this card out there, it provides a lot of value. So first of all, you have a hero response. After you change to giant hero form, heal 2 damage from your hero, and Ant-Man has cards that help him to change relatively frequency. So you can gain health multiple times, or at least sometimes, if you have the right cards in hand. Or you have this other hero response. After you change to tiny hero form, you draw a card. So the cards, so first of all, just changing to that form, let's say you're changing to giant hero form, just changing to that form, you draw a card. However, on top of that, he has his own cards that are events, which are the resize events. So he has 2 of these resize events. They cost 0, which is great because they replace themselves. Hero action, change to your other hero form, draw a card. So the card replaces itself, allows you to change form. And then if you do have the other card that I mentioned, which is his helmet, if you have this in play, you would, like I said, if you're changing to tiny hero form, you draw a card, or you're changing to hero form, you'd heal 2 damage. And the reason it can happen multiple times is not necessarily because you are using this card again, although I did find that I ended up with this card in my hand, with both versions of the card in my hand, because Clear the Area helped me draw. This card has its own draw ability. And so, but you also get to still choose to change to the other form. So this doesn't count as you changing to the other hero form by choice. This is changing to hero form using the resize card, which still means you have the ability to change to your other form by choice. Your one hero form change. So you can then make Ant-Man's helmet. Perhaps the first time you drew a card, and then when you choose to switch over to, let's say, hero form the second time, then you heal 2 damage to your hero. In addition to that, we also had, as I mentioned, the wrist gauntlets to help preserve health, because when you're in hero form, when you're in giant hero form, you can exhaust wrist gauntlets and pay 2 fist resources, which are called physical resources, and you can stun that enemy. So once again, the enemy wouldn't be able to attack you. And the wrist gauntlets also serve to help out with some confusion. So if you're entire hero form, you can exhaust wrist gauntlets and pay 2 energy resources and confuse an enemy. And so that's also helps out with protecting the schemes. So let's move on down here then. So that's threat prevention. So that leads up right to the next thing. So we mentioned already the wrist gauntlets can help confuse an enemy to prevent threat from occurring. But in addition to that, we have concussive blow as an event, and these 2 counterintelligence and under surveillance. So let's go back up to that. All right. So we have here it is, counterintelligence. So counterintelligence is a 2-cost card, and it's an upgrade that just stays in play. So you have this interrupt: when any amount of threat would be placed on the main scheme, discard counterintelligence, prevent 3 of that threat. And we also have under surveillance, which you can attach to the main scheme, and you increase the target value of that scheme by 4. So between the 2 of them, you can essentially prevent 4 extra threat from occurring. And then a couple of last other things. Notice there are 2 Power of Justice cards in this deck. That's because we do have plenty of cards that are relatively, that cost at least 2, that are Justice cards. So all of the allies here, so 1, 2, 3, 4 allies that cost at least 2. And we also have Concussive Blow, which I didn't go over yet, but you can confuse an enemy with it. And if you use a physical resource, you'll do 3 damage to that enemy. Then 2 stealth strikes, right? So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then counterintelligence and under surveillance, 7, 8. Did I count that right? Let's try again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And my general rule is when I have at least 8 of those 8 justice cards, in this case justice, I like to do the Power of Justice card. If I have at least 8 of them, I like to have 2 copies of the Power of Justice in my deck. I won't necessarily do that all the time, but that's kind of the general guideline that I like to go by. We also have 2 supports here. I didn't always get these supports out, actually. His deck very often ran itself. However, it was always extremely helpful when I got these out. So Helicarrier and Quincarrier. So Quincarrier, which is your resource card, wild resource generator, and Helicarrier, which is like a resource generator. It's not, but it reduces the cost of the next card that you play this phase by 1. And then to finish up with some last comments here. Overall, I was really impressed with Ant-Man's ability to handle a variety of challenging villains, even with a limited card pool. And it speaks to the power of his own cards and abilities. Meanwhile, I saw the value of cards that I hadn't really played in the past, such as Stealth Strike and Swarm Tactics. And so it was really nice to see their effectiveness, which I didn't actually mention. So let's go back up to one more. I did mention one of them, Stealth Strike, but Swarm Tactics. So Swarm Tactics is a card that I hadn't really played it previously, because there's only 1 copy of it, and you have to have Wasp out. And so I thought, well, why should I rarely get it. However, there is something to be said for if you have just 1 copy of a card in a specific situation, no matter what, you can still use that card as a resource. And so because you can still use that card as a resource, it's not a wasted card, and it just waits for its opportunity. I ended up using Swarm Tactics, which I'll go ahead and say what it does here, right? So it's a team up card, so you have to have both Ant-Man and Wasp in play at the same time. And it's a hero action, change to your other hero form and ready your hero for 1 cost. So changing to your other hero form, we always saw that that's powerful, but on top of that, being able to ready Ant-Man to allow him to, once again, let's say attack for 3 more, or do 2 more threat for 3 more if he's in hero form, or to remove 2 more threat if he's in tiny form, makes this a very valuable card. And even though it's just a one-off card, I actually found myself using it. I used it quite a number of times in these plays. All right, and I said I was going to come back to, the last thing were the potential deck modifications depending upon the villain. So this was the last part. So I played a large variety of villains. Well, there are some of these where these cards would just be useless, and so I would recommend changing them out. Now, I actually didn't change them out. That shows you how good these decks were, or Ant-Man's cards really are, in combination with the Justice deck, to be able to defeat some strong villains, even with what I consider to be a beginner or at least a semi-beginner deck. But for instance, Master Mold has Stalwart, which means he cannot be stunned or confused. So that means cards like Mockingbird and Concussive Blow, that Mockingbird who stuns an enemy, and Concussive Blow that confuses an enemy, relatively useless against a villain like this. So substituting Mockingbird with another ally, or Concussive Blow with, say, a 3rd copy of Stealth Strike, should make the deck more effective for a villain like that. And another example is against Project Wide Awake, which has the main scheme Knight of the Sentinels. Well, Knight of the Sentinels, let's check that out real fast. So Knight of the Sentinels has this. So this is a main scheme. And after a threat is placed here, if there is at least 5 per person threat here, if the first player places the top card of their deck face down under Operation Zero Tolerance, Operation Zero Tolerance is eventually a loss condition in this. So that happens no matter what. It doesn't matter if we make this main scheme have 4 more threat in order to for the villain to complete it. So that card is again a wasted card. So a better card to substitute back into there might be, instead of Under Surveillance, another copy of Counterintelligence. And even though you can only play 1 Counterintelligence out there at a time, Counterintelligence tends to get used up relatively quickly because it prevents 3 damage and then you discard it. So having an extra copy out there could provide some extra insurance so that the main scheme does not get completed by the villain. So overall, again, I was very impressed with Ant-Man's ability, even with, relatively speaking, a beginner deck, to handle villains of a variety of types and difficulty levels in standard and in expert. All right, everybody have a good one. I'll see you next time.